So welcome back, everybody, and I hope that everyone's had the chance to maybe stretch your legs a little bit, maybe grab a coffee, and you're back with us here now for the second session of today's proceedings at this year's conference. So having started off this morning with a focus on the C-band, we're now moving very slightly up the frequency range, and we're going to move on and have a look at the 6 gigahertz band. So obviously in the US and in Canada, a decision has been made to make the full band available on an unlicensed basis. And there's also a lot of decisions and a lot of debate going on all around the world about the best approach for the band in other regions as well. So really looking forward to this session. I'm sure there's going to be some really interesting discussion. So I'd like to now welcome to the stage our moderator for the session, Brent Skorup. Brent, welcome. Great to have you with us. And as I said, really looking forward to this session. So I'll pass over to you to introduce the topics and introduce our speakers. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And I want to thank Forum Global, Dan and Jordan, for putting this together. I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. We have a great panel, and I'll introduce each briefly, and then each panelist will do 5 to 7 minutes of presentation, and then we'll have time for audience questions and moderator questions. So I encourage you, as you're listening to the presentations, to type in your questions in the chat box. We have this morning Ira Keltz, who is Deputy Chief in the Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC. We have Gisette Gallant, who is Senior Director of Terrestrial Engineering Standards at ISED Canada. We have Mark Gibson, who's Director of Business Development at Commscope. Stacy Black is Assistant VP of Federal Regulatory Affairs at AT&T. Veena Rawat is Senior Spectrum Advisor at GSMA. And Alan Norman is Director of Public Policy at Facebook. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ira.
Thanks, Brent, and thanks to Forum Global for putting this together. So the 6 gigahertz band, are my slides up? Well, I'm not seeing them, but there we go. So next slide, please. So the 6 gigahertz band obviously has been a focus here at the Commission for quite a while, which culminated in our adopting final rules back in April of 2020. And this was a fairly significant decision as it tremendously expanded the availability for unlicensed devices through the mid-band spectrum above what we already had available in 5 gigahertz. A full 1,200 megahertz of spectrum, which was really set up to take advantage of the newest standards that allow for much wider channels, 160 megahertz wide channels, and put this on the path to be able to use even wider channels as newer standards are developed. So next slide, please. So what the Commission did is it provided for both outdoor use and indoor use under a set of different rules given the different circumstances that each type of device would see. So, first off, for outdoor devices, we only permitted that in certain parts of the band, and these are the bands that we do not have mobile services in. So, that, as you can see, is the 5925 to 6425 and 6525 to 6875 gigahertz bands. Still quite a bit of spectrum, 850 megahertz of spectrum for outdoor usage. And that is subject to using a database, what we called an automated frequency coordination system. For folks familiar with what we did in white space, this is fairly similar to that kind of a system, as opposed to the CBRS fully dynamic real-time type frequency coordination system. So those we called standard power access, and the power levels are comparable to what we permit for most of the other unlicensed devices throughout the 5 gigahertz band also. And so we provided for that. We also provided for indoor use across the full 1200 megahertz for what we called low power indoor access points. And this was designed to take advantage of building attenuation and distance in order to prevent interference to the incumbents, in particular the fixed service microwave links. But we also put other requirements on these devices in order to prevent harmful interference to any incumbents. So, for example, we require a contention-based protocol. We also, in order to keep these devices indoors, the devices have to be powered from a power cord or power source other than batteries. They can't have a weatherized enclosure. They must have permanently attached antennas, and so on and so forth. So, so we did set up these two different types of devices. The low power indoor, we allowed also lower power than what we allow for the AFC controlled outdoor devices, where the AFC system will, take a look at the environment based on our ULS. Actually, next slide, please. Based on the ULS and protect the incumbent system. So you can see here is just kind of a quick depiction of how this all works with fixed systems operating in the band, and an outdoor AFC controlled system powered off our ULS database would protect and enforce exclusion zones on specific channels in certain areas, and the indoor devices can take advantage of building attenuation and so on and so forth, and lower power in order to prevent interference. Next slide, please. So, for technical operational rules, I've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but some of the other highlights, there are some satellite operations throughout the band, and in order to protect incumbent satellite operations, we do require a power reduction for any antennas pointing 30 degrees above the horizon. So that will help keep any power received low. We also prohibited operation on oil platforms and cars, essentially mobile operations plus the oil platforms. And some of that also goes to protecting some earth sensing in the band. There's also some radio astronomy. And we also, the AFC will require or will enforce some exclusion zones around a couple of radio astronomy sites. I've already mentioned the low power indoor, and we also prevent these from operating on UAS, airborne type systems. So that goes a long way, again, towards preventing harmful interference to the incumbents. Next slide, please. So, the commission also, in order to make this work a little bit smoother among the various parties, had requested that folks form a multi-stakeholder group of interested parties, including the parties who were interested in unlicensed services, the fixed service incumbents, the mobile incumbents, which were mostly broadcast auxiliary type of services. And to the industry's credit, they did form the group, and they are working currently on several work streams. As you can see, one regarding harmful interference detection and mitigation, but also the others kind of go towards the AFC development, and one is looking at updating information within the databases that in the ULS that the commission has, and some of the standards along the AFC. I think Mark Gibson will probably give you a lot more information on that. And we've been in contact and gotten some filings, with the group and monitoring the meetings. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of open items that are still happening within this proceeding. We have a further notice where we were proposing, in particular, looking at very low power operations for very low power mobile anywhere type operations that some other administrations have already permitted. We are still studying the issue to figure out how we want to proceed there. And there were a couple other issues, such as potentially more power on the low power indoor access points, and whether to permit mobile standard access points using the AFC, and so on. So next slide, please. I know I'm getting short on time here. So we do have a couple of information requests One that had closed way back at the beginning of the year, where we sought more information on permitting client-to-client direct communications. And that, again, the commission's continuing to look at. But more significantly, most recently, just last month, we put out a public notice seeking proposals for the AFC systems. So we started a new docket to keep all that separate, and initial proposals are due the end of November. So here, we are looking to get all the folks interested in providing the AFC systems to submit proposals that we can then evaluate. And hopefully at that point, plenty of them will meet the requirements, and we will be able to get the AFC process moving so that in the not too distant future, we can provide for the standard power operations and make full use of the band. So with that, I'm going to say thank you again to Forum Global, and look forward to the rest of the panel. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Ira. Gisette.
Thank you, Brett. So similar to Ira, I do have a few slides to present, but this time it will be on the Canadian context. So I'm just waiting for my slides to be shown. Thank you. So if we can move to the second slide, please. So I will start with a quick overview of the licensed services in Canada and the 6 gigahertz band. So as the participants can see, we do have fixed services throughout the 1200 megahertz range. Our fixed licensees are mainly using the 5925 to the 6930 when it comes to backhaul applications. We also have other fixed services that are operating under the television auxiliary service in the 6590 to 6770 megahertz, and these are the studio to transmitter links that are operated by broadcasters. We also have other broadcasting auxiliary services in the 6930 to 7125, and these are TV pickups as well as electronic news gathering. So these ENG applications are more they are nomadic, transportable, so we do consider them mobile in nature. If I move on to the satellite services, we have FSS throughout the band as well. Our FSS operators are mainly using the 5925 to 6425, so this is where it's most heavily used. This is the uplink, so the Earth to space direction that is associated with the 3700 to 4200 megahertz for the downlink part of the band, of the C-band. Now, if I move to the radio astronomy site, we have one in Canada, and which is known as the Dominion Radio Astrophysical Observatory. And it is operating in the 6 gig and more specifically in the 6650 to 6675.2 megahertz. Now, the difference between Canada and the US is that we do not have any mobile application in the Uni-6 band, so from 6425 to 6525 megahertz, nor do we have any mobile application in the 6875 to 6930 megahertz. Next slide, please. Now, if I move to the consultation on allowing license exempt use in the 6 gigahertz band. So this policy consultation was released in November 2020, and we released the decision in May of this year. Most of the decision points were in line with what we had proposed in the consultation, which was to release the full 1200 megahertz for license exempt use. We also identified some the different types of RLAN devices that would be allowed. The first one being standard power RLAN device that could operate outdoor and indoor under the control of the AFC system. And as I mentioned, we did not have any mobile application in the Uni-6, so we did allow standard power device to operate in this sub-band. We did get a proposal to allow standard power device up to 6930. The department decided at this time that it would not allow standard power device in this part of the Uni-8 band. However, we would monitor the trends when it comes to broadcasting auxiliary services, and depending on the uptakes, we could allow standard power device through a future technical consultation. The other types of devices are low power indoor only device throughout the 1200 megahertz band. Same for very low power devices, outdoor and indoor, throughout the 1200 megahertz. And finally, the client devices that are associated with those access points. The power levels that you're seeing below, those are the power levels that were discussed in the consultation and decision papers. These would be codified through technical standard for the certification of these products after the decision comes out, or in the coming months or so. Next slide, please. So these are the use cases that we can expect with the different types of devices. So if I start with the low power indoor only devices, this could be for residential broadband services or multi-dwellings. And some of the key application that we could see is to support working from home, remote education, and e-health. And this has been really key in the last 19 months with the global pandemic. If I move to standard power device under the control of AFC, one of the key use cases that was identified by our rural wireless internet service providers were to provide broadband services to Canadians in rural areas. And then it could also be to provide broadband services to large venues such as stadiums. If I move to the very low power devices, it could include innovative applications such as wearables, augmented reality, and virtual reality. Next slide, please. Now, if I look at the protection of incumbents when it comes to standard power or LAN devices, for the fixed services as well as the studio to transmitter links, they would be protected through the use of the AFC system, where there would be some exclusion zone around those links to protect them. The AFC would also determine the permissible frequency as well as the power level of those license exempt devices. For fixed satellite services, this would be done through restricting the antenna elevation angle pointing upwards, as well as vertical elevation mass, so reducing the power level above a certain degree. And if I move to the broadcasting services, these are mobile in nature, as I mentioned previously, and there are no standard power device that would be overlapping these applications. And finally, when it comes to radio astronomy, it would be an exclusion zone that is managed by the AFC. Next slide, please. For low power and very low power devices, in order to protect incumbents, this would be through the power level that is mandated for these types of devices, as well as mandating a contentious-based protocol such as a listen before talk. Additional measures can include integrated antenna, as well as weather shielding for indoor devices. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. So here are the next steps in terms of enabling license-exempt RLANs in Canada. So we decided to go in phases. And the first phase is to develop the technical standard for the product certification of low-power indoor-only device. We did release the technical standard in the June timeframe, and the consultation did close in August. So we are looking at publishing this technical standard later in the fall, so in the near future. And after this is published, then low-power indoor device will be able to enter the Canadian market. The second phase will be to release the technical standard for standard power device as well as very low power device, and also the technical standard when it comes to the AFC requirements in order to designate AFC administrators. So this concludes my presentation. So Brent, I will pass the floor back to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Gisette. Next up, we have Mark Gibson from Commscope. Mark, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks also to Forum Global for the opportunity to speak today. As Brent said, I'm from Commscope, and we sit in an interesting position. I'm going to just revamp while the slides come up. In an interesting position here because I represent this business unit that does the SAS and the CBRS side. I also did work on the TV white space, so we have the frequency coordination. ComSearch, which is a business unit under Commscope, does frequency coordination for the microwave community, and we also do make microwave antennas, and we have the Ruckus business unit and the ARIS business unit. So we cover pretty much the entire ecosystem for 6 gigahertz. I'm going to talk a little bit about certification. That's kind of, Ira mentioned the public notice that came out, so I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about that. So next slide, please. So I've got a lot of text, so I apologize for all the text, but essentially what this does, it sort of lays out what the commission described in the public or in the report and order on 6 gigahertz for how they're going to test and certify AFCs. And of course, I won't read all of this, but try to point the highlights of it, essentially that, they are going to use a multi-stage process similar to what we've done in the past with TV Whitespace and CBRS. They'll issue a public notice to begin with. The public notice came out, actually, it was approved by the commission on September 30th. And the deadline, as Ira said, for that is November 30th. So all of the folks that want to be AFC administrators are fastly working on their proposals. The proposals will be submitted. There'll be a period for the public to review that. That period, I believe, is 21 days and closes on December 21st. And we thank the commission for not running it through the holidays. And once that happens, then the commission will conditionally approve the applicants who can demonstrate that we can comply with the requirements. And then we get into the test and certification cycle, which I'll talk about that in a moment, which will include a trial process, which is a public trial, as well as what would be probably controlled deployment. We call them market trials in CBR and TV Whitespace, and initial commercial deployment in TV Whitespace. And finally, the commission will not grant any AFC for commercial operation until AFCs can demonstrate that they can protect microwave systems from operation of standard power devices. So that's what the commission talked about in the report and order. If we go to the next slide, I'll summarize that a little bit to just, actually, this is from the public notice. So anybody that's interested in submitting a proposal to be an AFC systems operator must submit it, as I said, by November 30th. The commission describes in the public notice that if anybody misses that date, the commission reserves the right to put them on a different timeline, so to speak. And we saw this both in TV Whitespace and in CBRS. And in fact, in CBRS, they had 2 waves, wave 1 and wave 2. In this proceeding, the public is going to have an opportunity to comment on proposals. And then probably the AFC proposers will have a chance to address those comments. We'll see. Certainly in the discussions that we'll be having with the commission. The other thing the commission said, I don't think I have it in here, is that they'll host a series of workshops with the AFC proposed AFC systems operators, and in those workshops, more than likely, they will divulge a lot more information that's just not stuff they have to put on the public notice. And as I said, everybody that submits their proposal by the 30th of November will be looked at concurrently with equal priority, and they'll treat the ones after that differently. And they say that will not be considered mutually exclusive, which just means the grant of one AFC will not preclude the grant of another. So that means we're going to all operate together. And then we sort of go into the testing process, which I represent also the Wireless Innovation Forum, and I chair the 6 gig work in that. And we're working on trying to, interact with the commission on how that's going to happen in terms of testing. Then there'll be a trial period that'll include both a public trial, which will allow the public to come in and take a look at the SAS or AFCs and see how, whether or not they're providing correct results. And then there will be also a field trial. And again, as the public notice says, the commission will provide more details at a later date. So the next slide, please. I think I summarize all of this again. So just to kind of highlight the key points that we take away from this is that all AFC systems will be tested and certified for commercial operation. So the testing and certification processes are sort of open for definition, and we're trying to work with the commission on what that means. That will also include this public trial process and a demonstration period. So the public trial, as they said, will allow the public to come in and look to make sure that the AFCs provide correct results. Not sure what that means, so we're working on that. And then there's this demonstration period, which is the period for, again, we call it kind of commercial deployment or initial commercial deployment. And then, I think one point we wanted to highlight here is the experiences in the past with both TV Whitespace and CBRS is that the process can be lengthy in the sense that, those of us that want to build an AFC and that are waiting for the ecosystem to be commercialized, are waiting. And so for TV white space, it took about 3 years from the public notice being issued for inviting proposals to the public notice that was issued saying everything was open for commercial deployment. And then for CBRS, it took 4 years. I will note that in the middle of CBRS, there was a government shutdown that held things up for almost 6 weeks. And there were other things that happened. So it wasn't all just the commission just sitting on it. It was a lot of stuff going on in the ecosystem. And frankly, if it had happened much shorter than, say, a year, I'm not sure it would be much different. But those are the things that we're facing in terms of what's out there. So the next slide, I think, if you will, sort of boils it down into the various steps. Key steps were the initial public notice, conditional approval of the systems operators, testing, public trial and demonstration project, and then the public notice for nationwide operation. So the next slide, if you will, sort of lays this out in linear format just to kind of identify sort of what this looks like if we look at it sort of, again, linearly. So the first 2 steps, the public notice and the public comment period, are defined in the commission's proceedings. AFC proposals are due on November 30th. The public has until December 21st, first day of winter, to comment on this. Then we get into the commission's review. This will probably be the period between the public comment ending and the commission conditionally approving AFCs, where there will be a lot of meetings with AFC operators and the commission and OET. We had a lot of that during TV Whitespace and a lot of that during CBRS. Then we get into the public trial period, to the test and trial period. There will be a period of testing. We're working with the commission on figuring out what that looks like. Then the public trial, what that looks like in demonstration projects. And so, again, we're trying to work to minimize those timeframes and be able to get these things ready for commercial operation in short order. We'll go through all of that. The AFC systems operators will be prospective operators will be given their reports. We'll have reports from all of this. We'll submit those to the commission. The commission will then go through those and determine from those who is allowable to go to nationwide operation. And that's for the ones that submit on November 30th. There could be a different set of gates, if you will, maybe a different timeline for anybody that comes after that. But this is for those that submit the 30th. So don't know exactly when the public notice would be issued, and I'm sure IRA doesn't either for full nationwide operation. But we're hoping that is sometime in next year, and certainly no later than that. So I think the next slide is my last slide. So yeah, so thank you very much, and I look forward to the question and answer period. So back to you, Brent.
All right, thank you, Mark. Next up, we have Stacy Black with AT&T. Stacy, it's all yours.
Stacy, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Thank you for Forum Global for asking AT&T to join this important panel. We are very enthusiastic about additional unlicensed spectrum and 6 gigahertz being made available. We extensively utilize unlicensed spectrum in providing services to our customers. Many people don't know that AT&T is one of the largest Wi-Fi operators in the country, and we have thousands of access points in the United States. For example, AT&T Broadband, our customers rely on Wi-Fi to distribute signals through their homes and businesses. Our Wi-Fi capability is incorporated into virtually every device that AT&T customers use today and is vital to offload capacity from AT&T's wireless network when users are at home, at work, or at school. Having an additional band to provide our Wi-Fi customers to offload network capacity is of great interest to AT&T. So although offloading to Wi-Fi has a crucial role in AT&T's network, we strongly believe that there must be balance in allocations between licensed and unlicensed spectrum. And I'd be remiss in not mentioning that more licensed spectrum, specifically licensed mid-band spectrum, will be vital to ensuring our customers have the best quality of service in their mobile network. So having said that, AT&T is excited about the possibilities of Wi-Fi 6E because the 6 gigahertz band will mean greater bandwidth and greater capacity. Specifically, we're enthusiastic about the broader channels that will allow for greater speeds, including access to 160 megahertz wide channels that'll open a broad range of new capabilities for Wi-Fi networks, and provides an order of magnitude more of 80 megahertz channels and roughly doubles or triples the number of 40 megahertz and 20 megahertz channels. However, AT&T also strongly believes that incumbent fixed uses, such as fixed microwave services, should be fully protected from interference from any unlicensed operations in the 6 gigahertz band. There are numerous licensed incumbent operators, including thousands of fixed microwave links in the 6 gigahertz band, and their operations support vitally important services, including public safety communications, critical infrastructure systems, and commercial wireless backhaul. The FCC could have authorized the introduction of unlicensed devices in the 6 gigahertz band without risking harmful interference to those crucial incumbent licensed deployments by simply requiring that all unlicensed devices in the 6 gigahertz band use automated frequency coordination to guard against interference, rather than just requiring it for outdoor higher power devices. Instead, the vast majority of unlicensed devices in the 6 gigahertz band are being allowed to operate without an AFC system, and thus without the essential ability to prevent harmful interference to incumbent services, including public safety, critical infrastructure, and wireless communications. Considering that no testing was done to determine if the introduction of unlicensed devices will cause harmful interference, this has become a legal issue. AT&T, in fact, is one of many parties, along with public safety, broadcast, and critical infrastructure representatives, among others, that have appealed the FCC's order to the DC Court of Appeals. I'll leave it to the lawyers to explain the many legal grounds for the appeal. I'll just make one undisputed point. Besides not testing for the potential for interference, the FCC also never conducted any cost-benefit analysis regarding requiring AFC systems on all unlicensed devices in the 6 gigahertz band, instead of limiting the requirements to outdoor devices alone. As a final matter, AT&T believes that there has not been enough studies to analyze the potential harms from 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi devices to incumbent systems like microwave links. Southern Company, an energy utility supporting 9 million customers based out of Atlanta, recently filed in the record a report detailing extensive real-world tests that demonstrated a significant threat of harmful interference from unlicensed devices to licensed incumbent microwave systems operating in the 6 gigahertz band. AT&T is interested in and looks forward to engaging in a meaningful dialogue regarding that report with the FCC, the unlicensed community, and all other interested parties. We would like to see additional studies performed in order to perfect the record with regard to the potential of interference from unlicensed devices operating in the 6 gigahertz band. As an established Wi-Fi operator, it is in our interest to make Wi-Fi 6E a successful product. But as a licensee of one of the largest microwave network deployments in America, we owe our existing customers the due diligence to ensure their communications will not be interfered with by the introduction of an untested new product. Thank you. Back to you, Brent.
Thank you, Stacy. Next up, we have Veena Rawat from GSMA.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Brent. And thanks to Forum Global to invite GSMA. I guess I'm probably the only one speaking on the need for the licensed spectrum, because that's what my focus will be, a need for mid-band licensed spectrum for 5G. And as Stacy said, that it's vital to get the spectrum for mid-band spectrum for 5G. We can go to the next slide. Then, yeah, so the term used in ITU for 5G is IMT, which is the International Mobile Telecommunication Systems. So my focus is going to be what is going to be happening in the ITU process of WRC-23 for looking for spectrum. If you are looking for mid-band spectrum, then, where do we go? And WRC-23 will address the mid-band spectrum. So there, you need to actually show the demand for the spectrum. And that's how the agenda items are done for WRCs. So Colago did a report, a very extensive report, to look at the need for the mid-band spectrum, in particular in the 2025 to 2030 timeframe. And their conclusion based on all the detailed analysis and the assumptions they used, was that in that time period, one would need 2 to 3 gigahertz of mid-band spectrum. And that mid-band spectrum obviously has to come from spectrum somewhere between 3 to 6 or 3 to 8 gigahertz range. So that's the conclusion. Now, why 2 to 3 gigahertz? Really, it just depends. If you look at the assumptions, it depends on the population of the country, the economic conditions, network density, and a number, really a whole host of factors to get into to get this spectrum estimate for the mid-band. So the next slide shows you, if you're going to look, as I mentioned earlier, to new spectrum for 5G, i.e. IMT in the ITU parlance. This WRC 23, this is the World Radio Communication Conference, it is going to be focusing this an agenda item just on mid-band spectrum. And there are also bands, one band for low band and one for more on the capacity band. So it's going to be really focusing on somewhere between 600 megahertz to 10 gigahertz. But a good chunk of this focus of the spectrum is mid-band, ranging from 3.3 gigahertz to the 7 gigahertz or the 6 gigahertz, the whole range, which is under discussion here. So I'm showing you here because just what's going on in the ITU for licensed spectrum for just for 6 gigahertz. So this slide shows you all the bands under consideration under what we call, agenda item 1.2. If you look at the list, as I mentioned, the number of agenda items are dealing with the IMT spectrum, as I mentioned, low band to kind of high band, 10 gigahertz. But I have highlighted the 6 gigahertz band, 6425 to 7125 megahertz, under consideration under this WRC. The other mid band, as you can see, is 3300 to 3800 megahertz. And even if you get all this, take this spectrum into account, and remember the Coligo reports 2 to 3 gigahertz, you can see how important it is to actually have all the bands here listed in the mid band, the 3300, the 4800, I guess I had not mentioned that before, 4800, as well the 6 gigahertz, and the sum won't even come to 2 gig or up to 3 gigs, which is the demand in some of the major centers in some countries. So just because the focus here is 6 gigahertz, I'll tell you what's going on in the ITU in the 6 gigahertz. So let me move to the next slide and see, talk a little bit about, what's happening in GSMA. So obviously our focus is to look at the licensed use of the 6 gigahertz spectrum. And we did a survey with all our members, and because the members represent all the 3 regions. And it turns out that everybody came back and said that, or a very high percentage said that 6 gigahertz is high priority to meet their mid-band spectrum needs for 5G. Now, the thing is about these 6 gigahertz, why do we go to ITU? One of the reasons we go to the ITU is for the new spectrum is because it provides the opportunity for the harmonization. And we know the benefit of the harmonization, the economies of scale we get, and builds the whole ecosystem. So basically, this slide is just telling you that those are the key issues for 6 gigahertz. It is absolutely needed for mid-band spectrum for 5G. Harmonization is the key. The economics benefit, not only the economies of scale, but if there isn't sufficient spectrum then there are some economic penalties to the operators in terms of network deployment, and the cost of the network. And that's why, we are going to be looking at WRC 23 for a positive outcome for license for 6 gigahertz spectrum for license use. So going to my next slide, but it's I know you can't look at the details, but I'm glad that Josette pointed out that some of the existing users are in this band where we have to share the spectrum with are fixed users, fixed satellite users. And the key point I want to make, and it's in red here, is that the mobile allocation under which the IMT can operate is primary allocation globally. What that means is that if any administration, say China has been really pushing for license use in this band, if any administration wants to introduce 5G in 6 gigahertz band today, they can do that. But the reason to go to WRC 23 and wait for its decision is so that we have an opportunity for harmonization in 6 gigahertz. But the key point is that the mobile has a primary allocation in all the regions, and a license IMT being an application of mobile can be introduced in the 6 gigahertz band, 6425 to 7125. My last slide, and I'll just finish because I have the signal here, is basically we need to really look at the market assessment. We had all the previous speakers talked about the unlicensed use, the importance of the unlicensed use, and ITU decisions are not going to be, they don't decide on the market conditions, or ITU decisions are simply making enabling provisions. And IMT identification in this band does not take away the opportunities for administrations to use that mobile allocation for other applications. But if we miss the opportunity at WRC 23, then it would be difficult to get that harmonization, which is really, really essential for IMT. So all I can say at this point is that for the upper band, 6425 to 7125, we should look at the WRC 23 decisions. We should go with positive thinking about it. But as I said, these are enabling provisions. And if folks, as is happening, and as you have heard, if they continue to do the unlicensed use in this 700 megahertz in particular, unlicensed use is irreversible. So if we find going forward, 2025 onwards, that we need part of the 6 gigahertz range for license use, it would be, you can't reverse the decision. So I will just ask the consideration of some of these points when administrations and the regulators are looking at their positions for WRC 23 for agenda item 1.2. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Veena. We have one panelist left, and before I introduce him, I encourage those in the audience, if you have questions, start submitting them. I see a few coming in. Our final presentation is from Alan Norman at Facebook. Alan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Forum Global. And I'd love to thank the other panelists as well for the opportunity to speak this morning. Connectivity, next slide, please, is at the heart of Facebook's mission. We rely on both wireless access, both licensed and unlicensed, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, or future services and products like AR, VR, headsets, Portal, and future products, various wearables. The 6 gigahertz band will become essential for offering those services because the low latency and the larger channels enable a much better performance and much more interactivity. Next slide, please. So we were delighted about the decision by, next slide, please, by the decision by the FCC, and I said, We think they really got it right. This band was the most studied ever. There was a lot of deliberation. And Brett, can you go ahead with the next slide? And the one after, please, just to catch up here. Great. And the three use cases and operating classes that resulted really enable a bunch of different services, as well as do a very good job of protecting incumbent services. So low power indoor is something that's going to be very valuable for delivering, extending your broadband connectivity in the home, in the office, and enable lots of very low cost consumer products with very little friction. Very low power, which I understand is still under consideration but has been enabled and authorized in many places around the world, will enable all sorts of portable devices, mobile devices, such as wearables, and in particular is very important for AR, VR. And then standard power will be important both in the home for higher power or in the office, but also for a variety of industrial applications. All three of these have been carefully designed to protect incumbent operations. Next slide, please. So this FTC decision back in April of 2020 really unleashed a global wave of decisions. And as you can see on this map, both in North and South America, the full 1200 megahertz has been authorized for unlicensed access across the vast majority of the population and is under consideration in the remaining markets. In Europe, the lower 500 has already been authorized for license exempt access, and now studies are underway to understand how the upper 700 can be made available. And then APAC, Korea has already opened up the band for the full 1200 megahertz, is under study now in Japan, and then Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Taiwan, Hong Kong have already issued consultations, and there's study underway there as well. So at this point, it's not a question of whether or not the band will be made available for license access. Some parts of the world, that's already clear. And the only question now is how much will be made available for unlicensed access and what level of harmonization will be achieved for unlicensed. And this, in all my experience working in spectrum, I've never seen such a rapid expansion from one decision across in one country and then spreading across the rest of the world. It's clear that this was a very significant decision, and the impact is really appreciated. And to that end, if you look at next slide, please, the Wi-Fi ecosystem has already rapidly moved forward with developing products. And the expectation is that nearly 20% of all Wi-Fi 6 devices by the end of 2022 will support 6 gigahertz. And that is, a substantial number of devices. And next slide, please. If you look at it from a policy perspective, the economic value here is in the trillions in terms of the benefit moving forward. So it's the question isn't about economic value. It's really about how do we make this work. And let me talk about one point that came up. Next slide, please. That is that this debate about whether it's 5G or Wi-Fi or unlicensed versus licensed, I'd like to make the point that I think in this case, I think that's a false dichotomy. As others have pointed out, there are benefits to both Wi-Fi and 5G. So here's an example where Samsung in Korea is using 5G backhaul to trains in the subway, and then on the subway, making Wi-Fi available at 1.8 gigabits Wi-Fi speeds on the subway to users. So you have an example where it's not just offload, but now you actually have backhaul happening, enabled by 5G, and both technologies are being used to offer a broadband solution. Next slide. Similarly, Facebook just recently, in collaboration with Ray-Ban, announced Ray-Ban Stories, and the products in the market. And one of the key points here is that a lot of work was done to put all this functionality in a very tiny space with thermal limitations, with space limitations in terms of how much you can do, and as well as power. And so this device has Wi-Fi and it connects to your Wi-Fi access point. Next generation devices will connect to your phone directly. And this is about making, a balance of the computing power, the connectivity where you can have 5G for backhaul, and then deliver the immersive services that you'll see with AR, VR, on various wearable devices, including glasses. It's only possible if you have both 5G and Wi-Fi available to make that work well. And so I think that's a vision for the future that we can all embrace. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alan, and thank you to all the panelists. We will now go into the question and answer session, and I see some questions coming in. Get those in if you'd like to ask a question to the panel. I'll take the moderator's privilege and ask the first question. So we talked. There was some discussion of the incumbent users. There's some satellite, some fixed services, some nomadic broadcast services. And for anyone on the panel, can you talk? Incumbents never want new users in their band, of course. But is this a real concern? I mean, how common are the incumbent users? Are they very dense? Are they only urban areas? Are they rural? Are they kind of all over the place? And the answer may depend on where you are. But would anyone like to address that?
Yeah, I can take it. It's Mark, and then I'm sure Stacy has a comment on it. So when you look at the microwave community, you can take a look at the map of the microwave across the country, and you'll see a lot of white space, places where microwaves aren't. And in the in the suburban and rural areas, there's not a lot of microwave. But when you get into downtown areas, the microwave operation is really dense. In fact, I put together another deck for today's session that I decided not to do that kind of went into that kind of detail. And we've done some studies aligning the band plans for 6 and 6E, as well as the band plan for microwave. And, if a 160 meg channel can wipe out a lot of microwave channels if we're not careful with how we do the assignment with the AFC, or not assignment, but the spectrum availability. So from a microwave perspective, again, in a lot of the NFL cities, there's a lot of very dense operation. For example, we looked at the several counties in just the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Probably it was at like a dozen or so counties around the Metroplex. And there's 250 microwave links just in that area alone. And Dallas is, it's an NFL city. So from the microwave perspective, the operation in urban areas is really dense. Now, that doesn't mean there's not spectrum available, but it is dense. And, the commission laid out a really facile way of applying it. So, it's doable. There's other operations which are not as dense, but the microwave is pretty dense.
Yeah.
So then he's just letting her down. She's coming to me tomorrow.
All right, and I'll go to an audience question. This is from Timothy Jeffries at FutureWay.
That's okay.
What are the differences and/or similarities between? I think we're getting some feedback.
Well, I can bring that.
Is everyone muted?
Yeah,
sorry. From Timothy Jeffries, what are some differences and/or similarities between 6 gigahertz AFC and CBRS SAS? Can an embedded SAS with modifications be used to minimize AFC time to market? So what are the similarities and differences between the AFC and the SAS?
So maybe I'll jump in here first. So they are actually quite different, but that does not mean that a SAS provider couldn't use what they've already built to work here, because at the end of the day, they are essentially spectrum management type systems. The biggest difference, though, in CBRS, it is a fully dynamic mobile frequency management system that, with multiple layers of protection and the ability to move users around on a real time or close to real time basis. Here, the AFC, it's a fairly static environment, because remember, the AFC is only operational in the bands with the fixed service, not with the mobile service. And just because of that, fixed microwave links don't move, and you don't have a lot of them popping up, without any notice all of a sudden. So it's a fairly stable environment where the AFC then, based on the existing base of use, should easily be able to compute the various zones and frequencies where to keep where to put the exclusion zones for unlicensed devices. So it's a much simpler system. In fact, it's even simpler than the white space system down in the TV bands, because that also had to accommodate mobile and nomadic and type uses. So there's no reason a CBRS SaaS provider couldn't use what they've already built, and then keep add this on as another service to provide.
Let me add some color to that. This is Mark. I'd say theoretically, Ira is absolutely correct just in terms of the differences in the bands. However, there's a lot of major differences in the SaaS, not the least of which is having to connect to a sensor network that we don't have to do with AFC. Also, and Ira mentioned this, but I think it's probably worth highlighting, is that a SaaS tells a CBSD, which is the devices that operate in the 3.5 gig CBRS band, what frequency it's supposed to operate on, and then the device is supposed to tell the SaaS what it chose. So there's a lot of state information that the AFC, or that the SaaS manages, and that the device has to deal with. And SaaSes have to talk to each other. So SaaSes actually have to share information with each other. And that sharing of information helps facilitate or supporting commission's enforcement. None of that happens with AFC. With the AFC, what the AFC is doing is telling the device, here's the spectrum that's available. You pick what you want to use, and you don't have to tell the AFC what you're operating on. And so in terms of the differences, really, as Ira said, the AFC, or the SaaS, is a lot more specific and intrusive, so to speak, in the operation of the devices, whereas for AFC, it's a little bit more open. And, as an operator, probably going to be both of them, we're probably not going to use our SaaS guts to do the AFC. Another reason is that the propagation models in the AFC are very different than what we're doing with CBRS, largely because the band is different. And so those are just some other reasons. So there's no reason, by virtue of the fact that someone is a SaaS provider, they couldn't also be an AFC provider, because they have that capability, but not because they're going to use that actual tool to do the AFC. So that's an important distinction I think we should make.
And maybe if I could just jump on then one more point. So, the folks, the SaaS providers have been operational now for a bit of time, and they have experience in, doing the spectrum management type of function. So, we would expect, again, having done that and done a more complicated system, anybody who would like to provide an AFC, if they've already done SaaS, this should be much simpler and should be a lot easier for them to develop and put forward. And, also slightly off topic, but alluding back to some of what Mark had brought up in his presentation regarding timeframes, because this is a simpler system and the commission already has experience in approving the white space database and the SaaS database, we are confident that we can do this on a more accelerated pace, the approvals, than we have in the previous systems. So those are, a couple of other things that are happening here.
All right, next question from the audience. This is from James Aguilar at FTI Mexico. He asks, is the interference from a low-power indoor device to a satellite uplink communication in the 6 gigahertz band a real problem?
So maybe I'll jump in again to start. So we don't think so, which is why we've adopted the rules we did. We looked at this, and again, in an indoor low-power device, number one is low power, and these satellites are geostationary orbit. They're quite far away. So not only do you have attenuation through structures and potentially any blockage or shielding from terrain or other structures, but a tremendous amount of propagation loss over 23,000 miles. So we don't anticipate that that's going to be an issue at all.
Yeah, and if I may, also the same for ISAT, we do not anticipate any interference issue with these satellite services. And based on the studies that we've done, also looking at different studies that were submitted or part of different proceedings, we feel that the mitigation measures are sufficient in order to protect these satellite services.
And we have two questions which I think are similar from Simon Pike and Alex Roitblatt, asking about harmonization, WRC. To what extent? Maybe this is for Vina, but for anybody, some countries are consulting or looking at 6 gigahertz as unlicensed, others probably licensed. How much does this harmonization matter? Is it more critical for the 5G folks or for the unlicensed folks? And do you see harmonization happening at this point?
Let me take it, Brent, but before I go to that question, I also want you to comment on the incumbent situation. And I noted the comments made by Stacy and other folks about having the AFC for the entire band for low power, etc., to make sure that such important incumbents operating in this band in the 6 gigahertz range are not impacted. Well, one of the things is with the license use, you know where they are, and you don't implement any license use without doing a coordination. So that is one key factor or the benefit of the license use, is to do the coordination with the incumbents. The second thing is that Josette mentioned that there is a lot of backhaul in the what I refer to lower 6 gigahertz band, the lower 500 meg. If it's licensed use for 5G and it's backhaul in any part of the 6 gigahertz band, then it's within the family to manage that interference. All this to say that interference to incumbents is a key issue, whether it's unlicensed use or licensed use. And at this point in time, as we speak, there are extensive, detailed studies going on in the ITU forum to address the potential of interference to fixed service, to fixed satellite service. And I think I should mention the fixed satellite service band is extremely important, not just for developed countries, but also for developing countries. And I can't get into the details now because of the time. But it's extremely important to make sure that use for the developing countries of the fixed satellite will be protected. So coming back to the harmonization, harmonization is key. It's key for 5G, for all the reasons I had mentioned earlier. But we also know Simon and Alex have worked with me in the WRC and know very well that what I call the harmonization can happen top down. That ITU says, okay, IMT goes in the full 6 gigahertz band in all the regions. That's ideal, but that doesn't happen. It took us from 2007, the C band 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz, to get to 2007 to 2015 WRC, where we were able to make that 200 megahertz almost globally harmonized for IMT. So if it doesn't happen from the top level, that all the regions get identified for IMT, then sometimes we have to go slower because of the ITU being a UN process, slow process, and these WRCs only take place every 4 years. And I'll give you the example. I just gave you the 3.4 to 3.6, but also 600 megahertz. We have a handful of countries right now in that low band for 5G, but the ecosystem is developing. So United States started that. We have Canada went, and Mexico. And now at WRC 23, as one of my slides shows, that 600 megahertz is one of the topics to be addressed in terms of possible use for 5G, taking into account what the broadcasting use is going to be in region 1, which is the EMEA region, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So yes, we may not get the harmonization is key, but if we don't get it globally or even regionally, we start with X number of countries. And if some of these countries like China, India, and other large countries, in our region, in Americas, if they go for a licensed use, then slowly the ecosystem starts building and the harmonization, the benefits of harmonization start showing up. Thank you.
If I could maybe respond to that real quick. So obviously from the FCC standpoint, harmonization is extremely important. And on that, I'll note that, we are seeing a lot of harmonization within this band on the unlicensed, at least, in the lower part of the spectrum, I think, as Veena had mentioned. But, also in making, spectrum decisions and allocation decisions, it's a process we go through and a whole evaluation. And we go through this all the time: unlicensed versus licensed, auction versus non-auction, geographic versus site, licensed. And in full consideration of, overall needs of examining the band, we kind of saw, well, what's happening across this mid-band. At least, here in the U.S., we auction 280 megahertz at 3.7. We have an ongoing auction for another 100 megahertz at 3450. We provided 150 megahertz in CBRS. We're looking at 3.1 to 3.45 to break spectrum away for that. There's a lot of licensed spectrum, and in balance, as I think Alan brought up and Mark brought up, the value of unlicensed also for various applications, and also for synergies with licensed. They both take advantage of each other in many respects. So so on balance, we looked at this to provide this 1200 megahertz for unlicensed, fully knowing that there's a lot of licensed spectrum here, and the trade-off would be then a consideration of, yes, there are microwave links here, but I'm not sure it's so easy to just say allow licensed without having to look at relocating a lot of those microwave links, which adds another layer of complexity, where with the unlicensed, we can allow sharing and allow, more intensive use of the band without having to go through those machinations, which we had to do in some of these other bands. So, it's always a evaluation of various trade-offs to come up with decisions that we think are in the best interest, for the U.S. As we look at it.
All right, thank you. So I've got a question for Gisette. Any preliminary timeline for phase 2 standards? That's from Guillaume Lebron at Facebook.
Short answer, no. Not yet. We don't have a specific timeline to provide, but as we mentioned in the decision, when it comes to very low power devices, we are looking at other proceedings from key trading partners such as the U.S. and how this would land. So we're quite monitoring closely that proceeding. And when it comes to standard power device, it is linked to the EFC. And one of the key decisions in our paper was for ISET to adopt an AFC system that is practical, consistent with Canadian public interest, and harmonized with the US to the maximum extent possible. And this was really to look at an EFC from economy of scope and scale. So we are quite, looking at the stakeholder group, what is coming out of the stakeholder groups in the U.S. And also we will be monitoring the testing of the EFC very closely in the U.S. Thank you, Brett.
All right, our next question is for Ira and Mark, but I think for anyone who wants to answer. It's from Michael Calabrese at New America's Open Technology Institute. can the FCC significantly shorten the AFC certification process by using third-party testing? Yeah, so can the FCC shorten the AFC certification process?
So I think I already somewhat addressed this, that, you know, we're confident that the process can be quite a bit shorter than what we experienced for white space or CBRS. You know, as I said earlier, for a number of reasons I probably don't need to repeat. As far as using a third-party testing, it's something that some folks have come in to talk to us about, and I can't make any commitments. It's, you know, something we will consider, we'll look at, and if it makes sense, it's something we might be able to do. But we have to consider it in the overall scheme of things.
I'll go on the record and say yes, just because you know, the experience we had with TV Whitespace was that the FCC did the testing, and you know, and nothing against the commission, and you know, Ira and I have talked about this, but you know, testing software is not what they do. And so, you know, Mike, to answer Michael's question, absolutely yes, we could probably shorten it because if we get third parties. Now, having said that, if we're looking at trying to shorten the overall timeline, then getting third parties identified, up to speed, and whatever sort of accreditation it's going to take, you know, that adds to the timeline. So if in the end it's shorter for us to take another approach, which could be the commission doing it, then, you know, that's something that we would need to consider. So I think we need to consider the entire end-to-end timeline, just not trying to shorten testing at the expense of taking a long time identifying who can do it and accrediting them.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a lot of logistics that need to be worked out, you know, for using a third party. And again, it's again looking at the various trade-offs and what makes most sense. And, you know, we're trying to do the right thing. So, you know, we'll continue to speak with the stakeholders and kind of figure out how the process will best work. And, you know, we're going to try to optimize it the best we can.
All right, I have a question for the panel. So, you know, I wish Vina was here. She might have some input on this, but, you know, countries are taking different positions on licensed versus unlicensed. What would account for some countries going the licensed route versus the unlicensed route? I mean, the U.S. I mean, we have a pretty large device. We have a large market. We have a large device market. You know, what would be the critical factors for going as a regulator, going one route versus the other? And Vina made the point, you know, a good point. You know, unlicensed is irreversible. NTIA has made this point before. So it's a significant decision.
I can start, Brent. So in terms of Canada, we are a smaller market. So for us, it is quite key in terms of monitoring the international developments as well as trend, and to look at the equipment ecosystem and what is being developed, especially with our key trading partners. So and we do try to harmonize at the extent possible. So this will reduce technical barrier to trade, and also it takes advantage of the economies of scale. But with this said, what we also look at is our own radio environment as well. What is our policy objective for a particular ban, and also our legislative framework. Can we allow, for instance, license exempt in this ban, considering our legislative framework and tools that we have and the service that are in the ban versus, for instance, going with a licensed approach?
Brent, if I can provide a couple answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you. So Facebook is working with a variety of other tech companies around the world to advocate for opening the ban for unlicensed. And so we have a fair amount of experience engaging with administrations. And I'd say there are a couple things that we see. One is the incumbents in this ban are largely the same, not identical around the world. So they're really relying on the expertise, in many cases, of the FCC and in Europe of CPT, in understanding what was done. And so, you know, the knowledge that the FCC has and sharing that, as well as others about what studies have been done is extremely valuable in terms of getting folks to understand what the trade-offs are and what can and can't work. And so that's an important consideration. Another one is global harmonization. And that's partly why you've seen, such a, rapid adoption of this band. As you see, the Wi-Fi standards are in place, their devices ready. There are already substantial markets that have been opened up and people are moving forward. So that has a fair amount of influence in terms of understanding the economic benefit. But people also want to understand what's important for my market, my country, local interests, and getting folks on board. So there, a lot of the discussion, people have a huge investment in 5G being successful. So how do we understand how this band can complement 5G and help, protect, not just protect, but enhance the investment people are making in 5G and those services, because those are also so important and essential. There is a lot of pushback from the 5G vendor ecosystem. They don't have equities in other products typically. And so they have appropriately their proprietary interest to push back on that. We see a lot of discussion, but that is not, at a high level policy issue, that's not always something that's so relevant for the particular country. That's more about the different, stakeholders who have vested interests who are going back and forth. So we see a lot of debate around that.
All right, and we have another question. I think it'll probably be our final question. We have short time. From James Aguilar at IFT Mexico. Do you see a problem if NRU LTE operates in the entire 6 gigahertz band together with Wi-Fi 6? Do you see a problem if NRU LTE, which I'm not familiar with that, is that an unlicensed LTE technology? Do you see a problem if that operates in the entire 6 gigahertz band together with Wi-Fi 6? And that's for the panel.
So maybe I'll jump in first again. First of all, for outdoor usage, it's somewhat managed by the AFC, and hopefully, although the AFC is not designed to assign specific channels, it certainly can provide value-added services. So if there are, say, NR unlicensed LTE and Wi-Fi type devices in similar areas, that maybe those types of value-added services can be provided. And for indoor usage, again, people are going to make decisions for what they put in their homes or businesses, and I think can make decisions for compatible equipment. But that said, it's still all unlicensed equipment, and as such, there are certain features of the equipment that are designed to enable compatibility even for different, different protocols, contention-based protocol, listen before talk, and so on and so forth. So just like we see at 5 gigahertz, there we have unlicensed LTE, LAA type services operating with Wi-Fi. I think that certainly may develop here, and I wouldn't anticipate it would be a tremendous problem.
All right. Well, I think we'll close there. Our time is up, but I want to thank all the panelists and Forum Global for putting this together. I enjoyed the discussion, and Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Brent, thank you very much. And thank you, as Brent says, to all of our panelists there. Brent, thank you to you for moderating that session so well. And a big thank you as well to our audience for all of the questions that came in, which were a big part of that session as well. So really, really interesting session, and really appreciate everyone's time. So thank you very much for that. A fascinating discussion on 6 gigahertz there. And we're going to be continuing now with the focus on mid-band spectrum. Our next session is just about to start in about a minute or so here on the main stage. And we're going to be switching the focus to, I think, CBRS. Yes, CBRS is next where we're going. So we're going to be focusing on CBRS next and having a session looking at the emerging CBRS ecosystem. So that's going to be here on the main stage in just about 1 minute or so. So don't go anywhere, and we'll be back very shortly with that. And once again, thank you very much to Brent and to all our panelists for that last session as well.